I used to believe the hardest part of getting old was the body giving up before the mind was ready. The knees go soft, the hands shake when they shouldn't, and the house starts to feel bigger than it ever was. Turns out I was wrong. The hardest part is realizing the people you trusted to help you stand are already measuring the room for what comes after you're gone. I'm Harry. That's what everyone calls me. I've lived in the same house for 42 years, long enough to know every floorboard by the sound it makes. The one outside the kitchen sighs when you step on it. The one near the stairs complains. I fixed them all myself once. These days, I just listen. My wife passed first. Cancer. Quiet, quick at the end, cruel the whole way through. After the funeral, the house went from full to echoing in a single afternoon. Our son David stepped in then. He was attentive, patient, helpful in ways that made other people nod approvingly. He handled calls, sorted paperwork, made sure I ate. He talked about responsibility like it was a burden he was willing to carry for me. The trust was his idea, not in a pushy way. He said it carefully, gently, like someone suggesting a better chair for your back. He told me it would make things easier. Bills, maintenance, taxes, less stress. He said it wasn't about control, just convenience. I remember the smell of the coffee that morning. Burnt, because I'd forgotten the pot again. I remember the way the sun hit the dining table and made the scratches glow. I signed because it felt like love, because I was tired, because he was my son. The first change was small. The gardener stopped coming on Thursdays. David said he was renegotiating the contract. Then the cable went out one evening. He said it was a billing error. When I asked about my checking account, he told me not to worry, that it was all under the trust now, streamlined. That word again, streamlined, like a knife made smoother. I didn't push. You don't push when you're afraid of looking ungrateful. One afternoon, I went to the bank without telling him. Old habit. I wanted to withdraw cash for a donation at church. The teller was polite but firm. She asked if I'd spoken to my trustee. I laughed at that word, trustee, like I was a project. She slid a paper across the counter showing recent transfers. Large ones, clean ones. Out of accounts I recognized into names I didn't. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. My hand shook the whole walk back to the car, not from fear, from something colder. At home, the house smelled like lemon cleaner. David had been there earlier. He'd organized my study. My files were stacked neatly, labeled in his handwriting. I sat in my chair and listened to the refrigerator hum. It sounded louder than usual. That night, I found the safe empty. It wasn't dramatic. No forced lock, no mess. Just absence. The deed copies, the old insurance policies, even the watch my father gave me were gone. I stood there longer than I should have, like maybe staring hard enough would make things return. David didn't deny it when I asked. He smiled, tired, like I was missing the bigger picture. He said he was protecting assets, that the market was unstable, that I needed to trust him the way he trusted me growing up. That one stung more than I expected. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I nodded and said, okay. The word tasted like metal. What he didn't know was that I'd kept one thing separate, an old account my wife insisted on years ago, just in my name. In case, she'd said. I never thought I'd need it for this. I lay awake that night, listening to the house settle, deciding what kind of man I was willing to be at the end. I'm old, not helpless, and I've learned that sometimes the quietest choice is the one that makes the most noise later. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep stopped feeling honest. The ceiling fan ticked unevenly, a sound I'd been meaning to fix for years. I let it tick. It felt appropriate. I made oatmeal and burned it slightly, the way my wife used to tease me about. The smell lingered, thick and sweet, and for a moment, I almost forgot why my chest felt tight. Then I saw the empty space on my wrist where my father's watch should have been, and the feeling came back full weight. David called around 10, cheerful, asked if I needed anything. Groceries, prescriptions, company. He spoke slowly, the way you do with someone you think might break. I told him I was fine. I told him I appreciated everything he was doing, Both were technically true. After the call, I pulled out the folded bank paper again. The edges were soft now from being handled too much. The transfers went to an LLC with a neutral name. Nothing flashy. That bothered me more than if it had been obvious. This was planned, thought through, quiet. I drove to the old lawyer's office that afternoon, the one my wife and I used before she got sick. He looked older too, thinner around the eyes. He remembered me. That helped more than I expected. I didn't accuse. I asked questions, slow ones, careful ones. He explained what the trust allowed and what it didn't. He explained the gray areas. He explained how intention is hard to prove when paperwork is clean. I listened and nodded, the way people do when they already know the answer but need to hear it out loud. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store, bought a new lock for the bedroom door. The young cashier offered to help carry it to the car. I said no. Pride still works fine. That evening, David stopped by unannounced. He noticed the new lock immediately. His smile tightened. He joked about me turning the house into a bunker. I laughed, too quickly. We sat at the table where I'd signed the trust months earlier. The scratches still caught the light. He talked about future plans, about downsizing, about selling the house while the market was good. He framed it as relief, as freedom. I pictured the rooms empty, the echoes gone for good. I said nothing. When he left, I locked the new door and sat on the bed. The mattress creaked under my weight. I realized then that confrontation wasn't going to give me what I wanted. Apologies don't put walls back up. Promises don't refill rooms. What I wanted was control over the last chapter, even if it cost me the comfort of pretending. I made a call the next day, then another. I moved slowly, legally, quietly. I didn't touch what he'd already taken. That was his burden now. I focused on what remained, on what could still be decided without shouting. People think betrayal explodes. Sometimes it just drains the color out of things until you notice one day that the house feels colder, even in summer. I still set 2 cups out some mornings before I catch myself. Habit outlives trust. And as I move through the rooms now, listening to the floorboards complain, I know something else too. Being a father doesn't end when you're wronged, but believing your child will put you first sometimes does. The house changed its posture after that. I don't know how else to say it. It felt like it was bracing itself, the way an old dog does when it senses weather coming. Doors seemed heavier. Light didn't travel as far down the hallway. Even the air smelled different, like dust that had been stirred and never settled back where it belonged. David didn't come by for a week. That was new. He used to stop in under excuses that sounded thoughtful. Dropping off groceries I hadn't asked for, checking a smoke detector, looking at the roof even when it hadn't rained. Now there was silence, the kind that isn't peaceful, the kind that watches you. I spent that week doing small, stubborn things. I fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door. I reorganized the garage, even though my back complained the whole time. I wanted to leave fingerprints on my own life again. Proof I was still here. One afternoon, I went into the study and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. There was still one file David hadn't touched. Old tax papers, yellowed receipts. Nothing of value on paper, but the drawer smelled like cedar and ink and time. It grounded me. I sat there longer than I meant to, just breathing. The lawyer called 2 days later, said the first step was complete. No drama, no sirens. Just a line moved, a signature confirmed. I thanked him and hung up. My hand didn't shake this time. That surprised me. David finally showed up that Friday evening. He didn't knock. Let himself in with the key I hadn't thought to take back yet. He stood in the doorway like he belonged there, scanning the room. His eyes landed on the new lock again, then the bare wrist, then my face. He noticed everything. He always had. He asked if we could talk. Not demanded, asked. That was new too. We sat, same table, same chairs. He didn't pour himself coffee this time. Just folded his hands and waited, like he was giving me the floor out of respect. Or maybe strategy. Hard to tell anymore. He said he felt distance. Said he was worried. Said I'd been making changes without telling him. The words were calm, reasonable, almost hurt. I listened. I nodded. I let him finish. Then I told him I'd been to the bank. He blinked, just once, barely there, but I saw it. I've had 68 years of watching people lie politely. That blink was the only honest thing in the room. He didn't raise his voice, didn't deny it outright. He explained again, market risks, estate planning, protecting me from myself. He said my generation didn't understand how fast things move now, that the world had changed. I told him I understood enough to know when something was taken without asking. That's when his tone shifted. Not angry, firmer. He reminded me of the trust, the authority I'd signed over. He said legally he was within his rights. He said the house was an asset, not a shrine. That one hurt more than I expected. My wife's laugh had lived in those walls. My children's heights were marked by pencil lines on a doorframe he now wanted to sell. I made a decision then, not the big one, a smaller, uglier one. I told him I was scared. I let my voice crack. I told him I didn't understand the paperwork anymore. I said I was afraid of being left with nothing. I watched his shoulders relax just a little. Relief, not guilt. That told me everything I needed to know. He softened, reassured me, promised I'd always be taken care of. He used that phrase twice, taken care of. Like I was furniture he planned to keep polished. After he left, I sat alone and felt the weight of what I'd done. I'd lied to my own son, on purpose. And the worst part was how easy it came. That's the thing about betrayal. It teaches you skills you never wanted to learn. The next step took longer. Required patience. Required me to trust strangers more than blood. I documented. I recorded dates, conversations, changes. Not because I planned to explode things, but because I wanted the truth somewhere solid, even if it never left a drawer. Weeks passed. David came around more again, comfortable now. He talked about listing the house, showed me photos of smaller places, clean places, places with no history. I played along, asked questions, pretended to consider. At night, I lay in bed listening to the ceiling fan tick and thought about my wife, about how she'd warned me once, years ago, that love doesn't excuse attention. I hadn't listened then. I was listening now. The house wasn't empty yet. Not really. But it was lighter. Like something essential had been carried out without ceremony. And I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever happened next wouldn't feel like justice. It would feel like consequence. By the time autumn showed up, the house had learned how to be quiet in a different way. Not the heavy silence that follows an argument, but the careful kind. The kind that waits to see who speaks first. Leaves gathered along the front walk, and I let them stay longer than usual. Sweeping felt like pretending. David brought a real estate agent one afternoon. He warned me an hour before, said it would be quick. Just a look, no commitments. The agent was polite, young enough to smile with her whole face. She talked about light and potential and resale value. She avoided words like old and worn. I watched her eyes move through the rooms, measuring. When she left, she shook my hand like I was part of the furniture. David followed her out, talking numbers. I stayed inside and sat on the stairs. The wood was cool under my palm. I'd sanded those steps myself when the kids were little. Splinters still lived in my memory. That night, I pulled the old photo albums out of the hall closet. Not to reminisce, to inventory. Birthdays, holidays, vacations. Evidence of a life that could be boxed and priced if you let someone else tell the story. I put them back carefully, then locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slow until my chest stopped aching. The lawyer called again. His voice was cautious. He said David had noticed some changes, asked questions, filed inquiries, nothing illegal, but curious. I told him to proceed anyway. My voice sounded older than I felt. Or maybe it was the other way around. The next confrontation didn't happen at the table. It happened in the driveway. David showed up unannounced again, this time angry but contained. He stood too close. His jaw was tight. He said I was undermining him, that I was creating confusion, that I'd agreed to let him handle things, and now I was making him look bad. I told him I hadn't agreed to disappear. That stopped him. He laughed, short and sharp, like I'd made a joke without meaning to. He said I was being dramatic, that no one was taking anything from me. He said I should focus on my health and let him worry about the rest. That's when I told him about the separate account. His face changed. Not rage, calculation. He asked how much. I told him enough. He asked what I planned to do with it. I said I hadn't decided. That was the truth. He stepped back then, like he was seeing the space between us for the first time. He said something about fairness, about how inheritance works, about what he deserved for stepping up when his siblings stayed distant. I reminded him that stepping up doesn't mean stepping over. He left without saying goodbye. The following weeks were uncomfortable in small ways. Bills arrived addressed differently. Appointments were canceled without my asking. I spent an afternoon on the phone sorting out insurance coverage I hadn't touched in years. It felt like wading through mud, slow and exhausting. But every corrected line, every confirmed detail, felt like reclaiming a corner of myself. One evening I took the watch my father gave me out of a drawer where David had left it after I'd asked for it back. He returned it without comment, wrapped neatly. I held it in my hand and listened to the tick. It still worked. That surprised me. I wound it and put it on my wrist. The weight steadied me. I made my own uncomfortable decision that night. I called my daughter, the one who lived 3 states away, the one who'd kept her distance from David for years. I hadn't wanted to involve her. I still didn't. But silence favors whoever's already moving pieces. I told her enough. Not everything. Just enough to break the illusion. She didn't interrupt. When she spoke, she didn't sound shocked. That hurt more than anger would have. She said she'd suspected. She said she was sorry I was dealing with it alone. After the call, I sat in the living room with the lights off and listened to the house breathe. The refrigerator clicked. A car passed outside. Ordinary sounds. Anchors. David stopped calling after that. Messages went unanswered. I heard from the lawyer instead. Progress. Resistance. Delays. All of it slow and procedural. Nothing cinematic. That's how real consequences move. Inch by inch. I started packing my own boxes. Not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted to choose what mattered. Books first, then tools, then the small things no one else would recognize as important. The pencil with my wife's teeth marks from when she used it to put her hair up. The cracked mug she refused to throw away. One afternoon, as I taped the box shut, I realized something that settled heavy in my stomach. No matter how this ended, I would not get my son back the way he was, or the way I thought he was. Some knowledge doesn't reverse. I wasn't looking for victory anymore. Just ground that wooden shift under my feet. And as the days shortened and the air cooled, I understood that the house wasn't being emptied all at once. It was being hollowed carefully, by choices, by paperwork, by love turned conditional. I kept going anyway, because stopping would have meant agreeing with him, and that I knew I could not do. Winter came early that year. Not the dramatic kind with heavy snow, just cold that crept in through the seams. The kind that makes you aware of every draft you never bothered to fix. I wore sweaters indoors and let the house stay a little colder than before. It felt honest. The lawyer warned me that things were reaching a point, not resolution, a line. Once crossed, it would be hard to pretend this was still a family matter instead of a legal one. I told him to keep going. I didn't ask how long it would take. Time had already changed shape for me. David finally called after nearly a month of silence. His voice was measured, careful. He said we needed to talk like adults. I almost laughed at that. We met at a diner halfway between our houses. Neutral ground, he said. Like we were negotiating a fence line instead of a life. The diner smelled like grease and burnt toast. Booth vinyl cracked under my weight. David slid into the seat across from me and immediately started explaining. Pressure, responsibility, expectations. He said people thought he was doing well because of the trust. That he'd made decisions assuming I wouldn't notice or wouldn't understand. He didn't say sorry. Not once. He said the house was too much for me. That moving me closer to him would simplify things. That I'd thank him later. He spoke with certainty, the kind that doesn't ask permission. I stirred my coffee even though it didn't need it. Watched the cream disappear. I told him I wasn't moving. I told him the house wasn't his to offer away. I told him I was done pretending this was about my comfort. His face hardened. He said if I kept pushing, things could get unpleasant. Not a threat exactly. More like a reminder of leverage. I paid the check before he could reach for it. Old habit, he noticed. His jaw tightened. After that, everything slowed down. Letters instead of calls, meetings instead of visits. My name appeared more often on documents again, but always with conditions. Shared authority, oversight, compromise, words designed to look fair. I stayed put. Neighbors started asking questions. The for sale sign went up once, then came down quietly. David blamed a paperwork issue. I knew better. The lawyer confirmed it later. Something I'd done had complicated the timeline. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. One afternoon I found myself standing in the garage staring at a box of my son's old things. Baseball glove, school trophies, a cracked science fair ribbon. I hadn't touched them in years. I sat on a stool and held the glove, smelling the leather. It still carried sweat and dust and summers long gone. I almost called him then, almost told him I was tired, almost asked him to stop. That was the hardest moment. Not anger, not fear. That quiet pull toward peace at any cost. I put the glove back in the box and closed it. The final meeting happened without ceremony. Papers slid across a table, pens clicked, adjustments were made, authority rebalanced, not fully returned, not fully lost, something in between, a compromise that felt like swallowing a stone and calling it nourishment. David didn't look at me when it was done. He packed his briefcase and left first. I sat there a moment longer, listening to the hum of the building's heating system. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Back home, the house felt the same and different all at once. Still mine, still threatened, still standing. I walked through each room slowly, touching walls, door frames, the banister, taking inventory of what remained. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. Not well, but deep, and when I woke, the cold didn't bother me as much. I understood then that I hadn't won anything. I'd just stopped losing quietly. And sometimes for an old man, that's enough to keep breathing steady. I don't see David much now. Holidays come and go with polite messages instead of visits. Birthdays are acknowledged with cards that feel carefully worded. The trust still exists, reshaped, monitored, stripped of its quiet teeth. It's not clean. It's not fair. It's real. The house is still here, so am I. I've made peace with smaller things. The gardener comes twice a month now. I fixed the ceiling fan myself, ladder wobbling under my weight. Took longer than it should have. Felt right anyway. The watch still ticks on my wrist, steady as a heartbeat that knows it won't last forever. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening and watch the light fade. Neighbors wave, cars pass. Life keeps its schedule whether families do or not. I think about the man I was when I signed those papers. Tired, lonely, grateful for help. I don't judge him too harshly anymore. What I do judge is the idea that love excuses attention. I didn't tell this story to make myself sound strong. I wasn't, not the way people like to imagine strength. I was careful. I was slow. I was scared more often than I let on. And I learned that betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it wears a calm voice and uses your own trust as leverage. If you're listening to this, and you're the one holding responsibility for someone older than you, I hope you remember that care is not ownership. And if you're the one handing things over because you're tired, I hope you keep one light on somewhere you can still reach. I still set 2 cups out sometimes before I catch myself. Then I put one back. That's how habits fade. Not all at once, one quiet correction at a time. The house isn't full the way it used to be, but it isn't empty either. It holds what I chose to keep. And that, at this stage of my life, feels like a kind of victory I don't need to explain to anyone. If this story reminded you of someone you know, maybe sit with them a little longer next time. Ask a question you've been avoiding. Silence can be kind, but it can also be expensive. I learned that late. You don't have to.